Welcome everybody. Today we are actually tackling home canning of tomatoes. Since I grow a very large garden, one of the things that I like to do is process my own food so that I know actually what happens from the seed to the seal. So I process my own tomatoes in my own home kitchen, and I have some beautiful ladies here with me today that are here to learn the process of home canning, and I'm going to share it with you as well. So let's get started on what you're going to need to be successful in your home canning. All right, so to begin canning, we need to have a number of supplies, and we also need to make sure that our workspace is really clean. This is going to be very important. A lot of people are afraid of home canning because they just automatically believe that what happens in a factory is going to be cleaner and better for you. But that's actually one of the reasons I started home canning, is that I know what process is going to happen because I'm the one that's doing it. So I feel very safe and secure when I have all of the right steps. So you'll want to make sure that your counters are wiped down clean, and that your kitchen sink and any supplies that you use are dishwasher clean. It's not necessary for you to actually boil your jars before you begin this process. I'll be explaining to you about the hot jars when we get to that step. So I have here the supplies that you will be needing to purchase or have on hand to begin this process. And obviously we're gonna need a knife, right? You're gonna need probably a larger knife like this one that's longer for tomatoes. And you can also have a shorter knife, a paring knife that would be used to cut the core out. Both of these are okay. I actually just use this one for the entire process, but you'll definitely want to have a set of good, very sharp knives. As if you've worked with tomatoes, you know that if you have a dull knife, you're not going to cut the tomato. So it's really important that you get your knives nice and sharp and they're ready to go. So you'll have your knives. You'll want a cutting board. I prefer wood cutting boards, and please make sure that if you are a meat eater, that you do not use a cutting board that you have cut meat on, because we do not want to have any bacteria in the process. So you'll have to make sure that your cutting board's really clean. If you don't have one of those, I would suggest a 10% bleach solution to clean your cutting board before you begin. All right, so as far as supplies goes, we need our jars. My jars are all in the canners. I'll be showing you. For this process, we're going to be using quart jars to do stewed tomatoes. So I have those, and then we'll be doing a salsa, which is a pint jar. So you'll need those at least for this particular process. When you go to purchase your jar lids, you want to make sure that you have your tips and bands. Your bands are reusable, the tips are not. So once you've processed, you can actually take those bands and reuse them. They're mostly there just to make sure that everything's tightened down for the actual water bath process and the sealing process. So the bands are reusable, tips are not, and there's several different companies that you can buy them from. I actually happen to like the Ball company the best, because I know that they're really reliable, and I don't ever want my jars to not seal, because then I've just wasted some of my beautiful tomatoes. You'll want to make sure you get a reliable source for your tips and your bands. Some other things that are really important, I don't only use this for canning, this is called a jar funnel, and if you get one of these, you won't spill. So it doesn't matter what I'm using it for, whether it's canning or just, home use. This is a really great thing to have. I strongly suggest that you get it in metal and not use plastic. When plastic is heated, you will get some of the carcinogens from the plastic in your food. So I try to always use only metal on that. I have my cup and my saucer that I use. I use this to actually ladle into the jar. I find that this actually works better than a ladle because it's just easier for me to handle when the stuff is hot, and then a saucer to go along with that. Some of the actual tools that you're going to need only for canning, this serves actually a dual purpose. It's a measurer. These little steps on the top measure your jar, your head space. And you're going a certain amount of headspace. Depending on the recipe will tell you what type of headspace you need. For today, we're going to be using a 1/2 inch headspace, so that is actually marked on the second step here. And it goes all the way up to 1.25 inches, depending on what you're doing. This little bitty one up here is 1/4 inch. So this is really great when you don't exactly know how to measure your headspace. I'll be showing you how to use this a little bit later. Now the other side of this is actually a bubble remover. So if you have a process like canned peaches or cucumbers, if you're going to do a pickle, you will have trapped air inside of your jar, and that can cause the seal to break. So you actually stick it down into the jar and move it around to make sure that you get all of the air that's inside, that's trapped inside those vegetables. So that's actually what this other end is used for. And we actually do prefer plastic in this case because the metal, if it scrapes up against the sides, can be problematic. So make sure that your headspace measurer is plastic. And all of this stuff will be on the resource page for you at the end of the lesson. So you'll be able to have a one-stop shop to be able to pick up all the things that you need to prepare for home canning. A couple of other items. I prefer the really long spoons. It gets hot, and that way you don't have to reach down inside of these big canners. So I like to have a really long handled big spoon. My jar lifter. So this is actually what pulls the hot jar out of the liquid. So this is a really big help for you. Do not try to do it without one of these because you will burn yourself. So this is really, really important that you have this. And finally, since we're doing tomatoes, tomatoes are on the cusp of our acid scale. So I use an acid testing strip on the first batch that I do to make sure that it's at the proper pH. So what that means is that you want to make sure that your product in a water bath situation is 4.6 pH or less. If it's above 4.6, this allows botulism to grow. And quite often, this is what we hear about when people get sick from home canning. It's from botulism. Now, if you have a high acid fruit or vegetable, and tomato is the only one that's a high acid vegetable. The rest of them, like green beans, potatoes, corn, all of these are low acid, and they cannot be processed in a water bath canner unless you're doing a pickle. That means that you're adding vinegar and you're adding acid to the solution, and you're going to be below 4.6. If you're only canning, say that you would like to have cream corn for the winter, or you'd like to can your own green beans, you must do that in a pressure canner. You will not need the acid test strips for that because they will never be below 4.6. So that's really, really important. With tomatoes, depending on the type of tomatoes that you're planning on canning, they can either be a higher acid, like the ones that I have since I grow heirloom tomatoes. If they're a commercial variety that you've picked up in the store, just kind of the regular round red looking tomatoes, those can tend to be more low acid. So you may have to add lemon juice or citric acid to those. And I will explain that to you in the resource page. I'll give you some very clear direction for that. With that being said, I want to actually share with you a book that you need to purchase when you first start home canning. This is the Ball Big Book of Home Preserves, and this is the one that actually the USDA, that the government recommends that we use, that all of these have been tested in the government kitchens, and we know that they are safe for preserving. The other thing that's really great about this book is it actually teaches you all of the processes that I'm showing you today, step by step. So if I ever have a question about what I'm doing, I always go to this as my reference manual. I will never do a process that's not part of this book. There may be other recipes that I choose, but they have to line up with the protocols that happen in this book. So this is really important that you get a copy of this. I think this is an older version. There are several versions out there on the market. You don't have to buy the most recent version, but I would not go beyond, say, 2000. If it's below 2000, if it's in the 20th century, I wouldn't actually use it. So it needs to be somewhat modern. But I think I purchased this one in about 2005, and the USDA specifically said this is fine. I actually went to a class on it, so I know that this is a usable item. So you'll need to make sure that you get one of these, and it has, here's what's wonderful about this resource. It has every type of fruit and vegetable that you could ever imagine, lots of different recipes. It's got over 400 different recipes in it, so a lot to choose from. So if you want to go beyond tomatoes, there's a lot of other things in here. So you want to make sure you get one of those. So the first process in stewed tomatoes, which is the first recipe we're doing today, is blanching tomatoes. It's very easy to get the peel off tomatoes when you heat them up. You can do the old-fashioned method of just peeling them with a paring knife, but it takes a lot of time, and when you have a large quantity of tomatoes, it's very easy to go about just blanching them. So to create 7 quarts of stewed tomatoes, you really need about 35 pounds of tomatoes. I have that today, but some of them aren't in the best condition, so I'm betting that I'm going to get 5 to 6 quarts today. So to blanch the tomatoes, there's a few supplies that you need. You're going to need a pot with boiling water. It doesn't have to be a heavy boil. It can be just right at 212 degrees, just enough so that it can peel the tomatoes very easily. I'm gonna need a slotted spoon. I'm gonna want to have some sort of container. Sometimes I will use a colander, but this will work just as well because I'm using a slotted spoon. So you want a large container to put the tomatoes in, and then you wanna wash your tomatoes. You can just rinse them off in water. And the other thing I really want to point out to you today is that your tomatoes don't have to be perfect. As a matter of fact, I chose the ugliest tomatoes I could find today because those are the ones that you're going to want to process. Your beautiful tomatoes you're going to eat raw. So feel free to go and find tomatoes that don't necessarily look perfect. There's a couple things you need to know though about which tomatoes to choose. The tomatoes can actually not be perfect, like I said, and in this case, this is called a sun scald, and the tomato underneath is actually totally fine. There's no damage to the flesh inside. So I will actually just cut this part off, and the rest of the tomato is totally usable, so this is perfect for canning. I also have heirloom tomatoes are crazy tomatoes, and I'll have some that just end up growing really strangely. In this one, it was actually 2 tomatoes that grew together. This part is ripe, this part is green. I'll just lob off the top, and it's ready to go in the canner. If you have small splits in your tomatoes, these are also totally acceptable. You'll want to check and make sure that they're not soft or slimy. But if they are still intact, and they're perfectly safe to use. Where you go wrong with the tomato is when it's super soft and it starts to smell bad, if it oozes, or if it's clearly rotten around one side. You'll want to make sure that those tomatoes don't go in your process because we're going to be adding bacteria to that. But if they are intact, then it's totally fine to use them. They don't need to be pretty. When I talk about cracks, I'm talking about something like this. You may not see something like this in the store, but these are totally fine. I'll just cut the top off. Heirloom tomatoes also have something called green shoulders. The shoulders is the top part of the tomato. And so this is a natural occurrence when it comes to tomatoes, so don't feel bad about using this. This is not a bad tomato. This is the way it's intended to look. So all of these are ready to go in the canner. So I'm going to literally take them from the sink, and I'll get a pretty good batch of them going. And I'm going to basically put them in hot water for 1 minute. Sometimes with the heirlooms, if they're fairly green, like this one actually is, when I say green, it's unripe. It sometimes takes longer than a minute for it to actually peel nicely. So sometimes I leave them in for more than a minute depending on whether they tend to be riper. Actually, I'll save this one and do an unripe one, leave it in longer, but about a minute or so. Since we are stewing these, and if they cook a little bit, it's not going to matter. Sometimes when you blanch and you're making something raw, like if you're doing a bruschetta or a raw pico de gallo, you want to make sure that they don't cook, but for me, I don't care. So if I leave them in for more than a minute, it's not going to matter. So I'm going to take this batch of tomatoes, and I am going to actually, this is the other really important part of this process. I have got my double-lined rubber gloves that I have to make sure I put on the right hands. I've got my double-lined gloves here because you're going to want to make sure that you have on long sleeves and that your gloves pretty much come up to your sleeves. And the other really important, 2 important items, an apron, because these are going to splatter all over you, or you can wear some really old clothes that you don't care about. Do not wear flip-flops. Forget about it. You have to make sure that you have on rubber-soled shoes that are totally enclosed, because I guarantee you, you're going to drop hot water on your feet. So you want to make sure that you are properly clothed before you begin this process. You don't want to get hurt. So I'm going to take these and I'm going to put them in the water, and they're going to go for about a minute. All right. Okay, so the way that I know that these are done, if you'll see that the skin has split on this, so that I know it's ready and easy to peel. So I'm just going to take them out of the bath. You can see that one's nice and split too. And we're going to dump them into ice water. And since I do a large amount to make stewed tomatoes, I actually have the water bath or the ice bath in my sink. So I will plug up one side of my sink and then I'll dump them in there, and then we begin the process of peeling them, and then we quarter them. And that's all you have to do to create the stewed tomatoes. They go right in the pot without any water. You can add a half a teaspoon of canning salt if you wish. I actually do mine without salt because if I salt my soup, I'm gonna salt it the way I want it after I'm done. That way I actually have less sodium in my diet by putting the salt in at the end, so it's not absorbed deeply into the fruit or vegetable. So these will now go into the ice bath, and we will begin the process of peeling them. So this is canning salt. This is really important, and we'll see this too in the salsa recipe, that you use only canning salt for your recipes. This is granulated in a specific way to make sure that the amount of sodium that you use is predetermined. So in the teaspoon, you want to make sure that it's granulized in the right way. If you use sea salt, if you use like a rock salt, the amount of sodium that you use is going to be different, and that is not what you want when you come to canning. Sometimes salt is used as a preservative, so you want to make sure that you have the correct amount of salt in there. Otherwise, your food may not be preserved properly. In the case of tomatoes, salt is not part of that recipe to keep it preserved, so it's not necessary. I'm mostly talking about pickling, that kind of thing. You're definitely going to want to use salt, but any kind of recipe that you use, you'll always want to make sure that you have canning salt on hand. And I will again have this available for you in the resource page so that you know where to locate it. Okay, so I'm actually going to peel this tomato for you. You can see this is one I showed you that had the sun scald on it. So actually the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the core out of this tomato. I'm just going to go around the top, and I'll probably actually get all of the weird looking stuff on there. And then I'm going to actually cut this out because it's very hard to peel with this on. And then it should just come right off. This peel is just gonna, especially with these heirlooms, it has a very, very thin peel. I cut off the bloom end on that as well. And then for this one, because it had that spot on it, I will cut around it because it doesn't want to peel very well. With stewed tomatoes, you want to make sure that you get the peel off, otherwise the peel will roll up inside of your jar and you'll have little bits of peel. It won't hurt you, but it just keeps the product from looking as pretty as you might like. So then, all I do is quarter these tomatoes. So I'm going to quarter these tomatoes, and I'm going to put them right in the pot that I'm going to be stewing them in. With stewed tomatoes, you do nothing else. You don't add water. This is not something that you're going to cube up and add water to. We're actually going to stew these down, so it's only the tomato that goes in the pot, nothing else. I'm going to take the peel, and I put it in these big containers, and then I take them out. You can give them to your chickens if you have them. You can, or throw them in your green container, or you can put them in a compost bin. So they're, I wouldn't suggest putting them down your garbage disposal because there's a lot of them by the time you get done. We're gonna process all of these and put them in the pot, and then we're actually gonna stew it down. So that's the next part of the process. Okay, so I want to show you in this next batch of blanching that I'm going to do, these tomatoes are smaller. I actually size my tomatoes. If you're buying commercial tomatoes, they're already sized before you get them. Or even quite often in a farmer's market, they'll be sized relatively, which is what I'm doing here. But I don't want to blanch small tomatoes with big tomatoes because they cook at different rates. So I try to size them fairly uniformly, so that when they get in the water, I can take them all out at the same time and not have to worry about them overcooking. All right, so we have blanched all the tomatoes and quartered them, and they are now in my very large, this is a 21 quart stainless steel cooker. And I like to do as much as I possibly can because I have a couple of different pots that I can use to water bath in, so it really doesn't matter the quantity for me, but I would guess this is probably 6 to 7 quarts if I had to make a guess. And we're going to actually stew these down, and you'll be seeing that process as we do it. For now, they still look raw because they've just started the process, and I'll show you what they look like actually when it's time to put them in the jar. So for now, we're just gonna let them cook down with the lid off because I like for it to, some of that liquid to evaporate so that it concentrates the flavor of the tomatoes. So that's where we are on this process right now. So this actually is about our halfway point on the stewed tomatoes. You can see they're starting to break down. They still have a lot of big chunks in them. We're starting to get a nice stew on these. That the water is not clear anymore, that the juice is not clear, that it's starting to cloud up, and that's actually a good thing. We want the pieces of tomatoes, they kind of ruminate and move together. And we want to keep it boiling for quite a while. I'm going to take the lid off now so that it actually evaporates some and we get that nice concentrated tomato flavor. But this has still to stew down. It'll probably end up looking more like this when we're done. But I still have a lot of pieces that need to stew yet. So I'm going to let this go for a while. Yet probably about another 15 minutes on that. So this is my test strip right here, and I just tested the stewed tomatoes to make sure that I didn't have to add acid to them, because like I said earlier, sometimes commercial tomatoes can be less acidic than the heirlooms, but these are my heirlooms, and this is running right in between, say 3.5 and 4.0. So I know that they're safe to can without adding any citric acid. I just need to be below 4.6, which is this kind of darker green over here. So these little test strips are really handy when you're unsure whether you are hitting that 4.6 mark or not. But I'm well below that, so I know that I'm in the safe range to can. So in here, this is actually a canner that you can put on your countertop. And I like to use this because it actually allows me to do more work. Although I caution you, if you have not canned before, I would never suggest doing more than one process at a time. But because I'm taping this for you all to be able to use, I decided in the best interest of my time that I would actually do more than one process at a time. But I really, really don't recommend this unless you are a very, very good canner. So this, being an electric one, sits on the counter. It keeps the kitchen from being as hot, actually, and it probably is more efficient. Really, I can get my jars hotter faster with this one, but I do use both processes. But inside of here, I have my jars. They need to be at minimum 3/4 full with very hot water. It does not have to be boiling to actually place your product in the jars, but they need to be very, very hot, nearly to the point of boiling. So these are waiting on the stewed tomatoes right now. And as soon as I fill these, then I will boil it for a certain amount of time, and I'll talk about that then. But this is how the jars are waiting for me to actually process. All right, so I'm gonna show you guys how to actually jar these up. So I am going to take, again, I've got my double lined rubber gloves. And I can actually turn this down. This is an induction burner that I'm using here. So I can actually turn this down to either 212 or even 140 because it doesn't need to boil necessarily for me to get it in the jars because it's already so hot, and I'll get it in the jars so quickly that I'm not going to lose any very much heat on that. So I'm going to take this and literally fill this jar up. And this is why I said I like to use a cup with a handle on it because it's so much easier to actually get these in the jar than trying to use a ladle. And then if you're messy like I am, you probably get too much in there. Use your spoon and get it out. And then I'm going to use my measuring tool to make sure that I'm at a 1/2 inch head space. This is going to be about right, but I betcha it's more like 3/4. Yep. It's still, there's a little space right there. I wanted to actually land on the tip of this. So I've done this for so long that I knew I needed more. But if you are new at this, you'll want to check your head space. It's really important for the sealing. Is it too loud? Okay. So now I guarantee you this is a 1/2 inch. Yep, exactly right. So I'm going to wipe the jar rim very carefully with a clean towel that is slightly damp. You don't want to use a dry one because you might not get all the pieces off. Then I'm going to add my jar lid, which is in hot water, and I'm going to screw it tight. And you want to make sure that it's threaded properly, which is a problem that can arise sometime. This one is not wanting to cooperate. There it goes. And what we call it is fingertip tight. So I screwed it as tight as I possibly can with my fingertips, and then I place it in the hot water. And I'm gonna do this 6 more times. And that is when I fill up my canner, and we'll talk about how to process them in a minute. So at this point, I filled all of the jars. This canner will hold 7 quarts, and I filled it with hot water so that there is at least an inch of water covering the top of the jar. That's very, very important. So this particular system has kind of a corrugated lid that you put on the top that's supposed to dispel the heat better. So I'm gonna add that to it and put my lid on. When this comes to a full boil, you need to make sure it comes to a full boil. You are going to begin timing how long this boils. And for stewed tomatoes at this altitude, I'm looking at 40 minutes. If you're above 3,000 feet, it's actually 45 minutes, and you add 5 minutes for every 1,000 feet above that you are. So above 3,000 feet, you start adding 5 minutes for every 1,000 feet. But since I'm at 2,600 feet here, then I can just go by what the recipe tells me to do, which is 40 minutes. So when this comes to a boil, I'm gonna start timing at 40 minutes, and then I'll show you what they look like when they come out of the canner. All right, so now my process is finished. This has spent 40 minutes in a boiling water bath canner. So when you're done, you can actually turn the heat all the way down, and you can let it rest. So if you can let it rest, I would say 5 to 10 minutes, just so that it's not boiling on top of you when you go to take it out. And so I'm going to take off this corrugated lid, and these need to be spaced on a clean towel, and they will they'll rest there overnight, so they need to rest for 24 hours. And I just put enough space between them so that they have air circulating around them. And that is the entire process. So this is nothing in this jar but stewed tomatoes. There's no salt, there's no water, there's nothing else in it. And I also know that the jar is clean. There's no BPA in this jar. And the lid actually never touches the product, so I don't even have to worry about what might be on the lid, because the lid, remember, we have that 1/2 inch headspace on there. So I had 35 pounds of tomatoes, and it actually made a little bit more than I thought. I have 7 quarts, plus I also had 1 additional quart that I didn't actually water bath, that I just kept for my own fresh use right now. So after you're done with the process, you just want to make sure that it does indeed sit for 24 hours. And each one of these, even though they're a little bit high right now, they will go ahead and come down with the pressure, and they will be sealed. And I'm trying to see if one of them looks sealed. Maybe this one right here is already sealed. So after they're not so hot, they'll go ahead and seal up, and that is all of this process. So here we have our 7 quarts of stewed tomatoes. So before you wrap up, one of the things that I want to make sure that you do is that you actually label your jar with at least the date. With the salsa, I'll put on there salsa and the date, but with this one, I know it's stewed tomatoes. So all I do is make sure that I have the date. I took a Sharpie and put the date on there so that I can keep up with when it was done. You'll want to make sure that this lasts between a year and a year and a half. You'll want to use it up by that time. So the other thing that many canners do is they actually take the lid off and just store it in this way, because the ring can be used more than once. So also it's a good process, because if you do have some kind of spoilage, sometime the lid will rise up and then it'll settle back down and you won't even know it, because because the ring is on there. Okay, so when you take the ring off, you can also notice for any sort of problem that might arise, although it's quite rare, especially with tomatoes. So that's really the other thing that I wanted to point out to you, to make sure that you are careful about labeling your jars. So finally, I want to encourage you to take your health in your own hands and try some home canning. It may seem like a daunting task at first, but there's some really easy tips that you can do in your own life to make it possible. Find a farmer. There's a lot of places that you can go to get fresh produce at a reduced price. As a matter of fact, that's one thing that I do in my own communities. I give other people produce so they can actually undertake this process themselves. So if you know someone, great. If not, there's a lot of resources on the internet, and I'll even put some at the end of this video to be able to help you find those resources. Next, if you're afraid of doing it because you've never done it, there's only one way to overcome that, and that's to try it. So if you make a mistake, oh, that's really cool. We had one that just sealed when I was talking. That's really awesome. But if you make a mistake, then you just learn from that mistake. It's not that costly. You're getting lower cost produce. So just try it out and see what happens for you. Don't be afraid of the process. And remember, I'm here to help you every step of the way. So go into the community forums, post what you think about this, and share with us what you've done to create your own food at home.